Welcome to Neurodivergent Faith, a podcast to help you navigate the beautiful and complicated intersection of neurodivergence and Christian faith and practice. Whether you're neurodivergent yourself, or you're a friend, family member, or church leader seeking to understand more about the neurodivergent Christian experience, you're in the right place. My name's Josh Davis. I'm autistic, ADHD, a spiritual director, and an ordained pastor. And I'm delighted to have you join me as we explore the unique ways neurodivergent people experience God, worship, community, and scripture, along with special interests, sensory and attention differences, social and communication challenges, and much more. Together, we'll break down barriers, confront misconceptions and assumptions, and celebrate the beautiful diversity of God's creation in all of us. So, if you're ready to think deeply and creatively, to reconcile your faith and your brain wiring, or you just want to hear what it sounds like when neurodivergence and Christianity have a conversation, come on in. It's a bit messy, definitely interesting, and we wouldn't have it any other way. We don't do small talk here, so let's jump into something real, raw, and robust. Are you ready? Take a deep breath. Hold it. And let it out with a sigh. All right, here we go. Well, welcome back to Neurodivergent Faith podcast. I'm glad you've joined today. This is one of our special episodes for Autism Acceptance and Awareness Month. So we're going to be focusing today on autism and the glory of God. And I'm excited because I've got a conversation partner. I'd like to introduce Harrison Litzell. Harrison, welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I'm really excited to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Maybe your neurotype and anything else you would want us to know about you.
Sure. So I live in Atlanta. I have recently discovered my autism. That's something that's been kind of a recent part of my journey and my life. I am an ordained minister. I work at a leadership center at Mercer University, helping churches, lay leaders in churches with education and training and leadership development. I'm originally from Florida. Josh and I actually we have just met recently, but our families go way back in a bunch of kind of entangled ways. And so it is an absolute delight to kind of connect in this way and to be a part of this project.
I'm so glad to have you. I know you've done some work with faith communities around neurodivergence, among other things. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So some of my background is in children's ministry. And so I've been working over the past few years now, like I said, kind of supporting churches and different resources and opportunities. And a lot of what has come of that is working with churches as a whole, as well as folks specifically in children and youth ministry on the work of inclusion. And with that came this idea, and the way that we often talk about it is I want to talk to churches about inclusion, and I don't want to have to come back next year to talk about neurodivergent inclusion. And so let's go ahead, and when we talk about inclusion, let's talk about inclusion of all people, thinking about neurodivergence, thinking about disability, and so that's been a big part of my work, is kind of really diving into largely the education space and learning what I can from pedagogy and education and neurodivergence, and then translating that into faith spaces, which has been really fun and something that's really seemed to connect with a lot of churches, of a place where they can see, oh, this is a place where we have kind of a growing edge and a real desire to do that. So it's been a really kind of energizing place to work.
And you were doing some of that work before you realized you were neurodivergent yourself.
Yeah. So this was something, like I said, I've been doing for a few years. And as I was doing this work, I was like, wow, this stuff is really great. It's just so helpful. And, it's such a great topic. I love spending time with it. And then as I kind of began to learn about my own neurotype and my own autism, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this makes sense. Why I felt such sustained energy on this topic, and why there were so many things I was learning about how to support neurodivergent people in worship spaces that I started to adapt them for my own use. And then as it just kind of became like, oh, okay, yeah, that all makes sense. That all tracks. And so it's been an interesting part of that journey.
Very cool. And I'm sure some of that will come up in our conversation today, but maybe also for the future, we could have a conversation around that kind of inclusion in worshiping communities. For today, though, I'm curious to get to know you a little bit better as a person, and I'd love to know what's something that bothers you a lot or drives you crazy.
Yeah. So you caught me at an interesting time with this question. It being tax season, this is kind of an annual thing for me of I use TurboTax to do my taxes most years, which always brings to me this point of real frustration uh, with so many of the tax preparation services that we often use in the United States. They lobby with a lot of money, millions and millions of dollars, to make sure that the tax code stays difficult and challenging to navigate so that we have to continue to use those services. So when we use things like TurboTax or H&R Block, they then use the profits they make off of us by helping us prepare our taxes to lobby the government to make sure that the tax code stays complicated so that we have to continue to use TurboTax and H&R Block to complete our taxes.
That is
Um,
not okay. That is not.
yeah, yeah, and so that, like I said, every year I kind of like sit with this for a few months as I have to deal with it. And there are some kind of ways around it, but it is something that gets to me every year, and I end up talking to many, many people about it.
Well, you know the phrase ignorance is bliss. I've been
Yeah.
ignorant about that, but I don't know that I'll ever be able to not think about that from here
Hmm.
on. Gosh, yeah, that's not okay. Um, and I don't like being part of a system like that. But then also,
Hmm.
I really like the ease of using those programs. So that's frustrating. What's something,
Yeah.
on the other hand, that you could research about or talk about or just get immersed in for hours? Something you really enjoy?
Yeah, this is I'm gonna go from the kind of frustrating to the lighthearted of I for some reason really love fast food breakfast. That is something that I just, again, it's not good for me. I shouldn't love it as much as I do, but I do. I love finding different new things. I love all the different options that there are. There's nothing more than a greasy food wrapped in whatever that substance is that it's wrapped in a drive-through in the morning. And so the other day, my wife and I were headed somewhere and she needed to get some breakfast on the run. And so I then started to tell her about all the different options from all the different fast food places we were passing. And I began to realize, oh, this is an uncommon amount of knowledge to have about these options, as well as their price ranges and value deals and all of those things. So I don't purposefully research that, but it does seem to be something that I tend to keep the knowledge and keep tabs on as I go through my life.
Yeah, and it sticks with you. Do you have
Yeah,
a
yeah,
go-to
that's right.
right now? Like if you had to get breakfast this morning from a fast food restaurant, where would you go? What would you get?
Wendy's, their potato wedges that they have in the morning are
Okay.
very good, very well seasoned. So that's something that has been kind of on my mind recently, is the Wendy's potato wedges.
I've never had Wendy's for breakfast. I might have to try
It's
it.
it's pretty good.
I also have this thing where if I'm going to eat breakfast out, it's going to be probably a sausage, egg, and cheese McMuffin at
Okay.
McDonald's. And I just love those things. And again,
Yeah.
there's this part of me that's like, I probably shouldn't eat this, but I really enjoy it. Yes.
Yeah. And it's sometimes it is nice to know like this isn't good for me and I enjoy it. And just to have that simplicity of like, nope, no nuance here. This is not good for my body. But it's delicious. And every once in a while it's gonna happen.
Yeah. You said that you just recently discovered your autism, and I'm curious what it was like for you growing up, not understanding your neurotype, whether that was in family or
Hmm.
school or faith communities. What was it like for you?
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the way that I've described learning about my autism to folks is that it feels like a connect the dots picture, kind of, where when I was filling out like the autism assessment stuff and all of that kind of things, so much of the information that I was recording in that, I was like, oh yes, these are things that I know about myself. I didn't really learn any new traits or aspects of myself in that process, but I did not know that when you wrote them all out together, that if you connect those dots, it spelled out autistic, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so looking back on like childhood and adolescence, there were times, honestly, I can remember having kind of brief conversations with different people along the way of like, hey, I think there might be something different about the way that I'm processing this, and kind of engaging with that in a few different ways, but never in a prolonged or nothing ever really came of it. And so it is just kind of looking back now of like, still, I think I am still in the process of, oh, this happened because I was autistic, and this is the way that I was interpreting this information in a way that was different than other people, or this is the way in which being autistic like reshaped my experience in this way. And I think that I'm still kind of in a place where I don't have anything definitive to say about that one way or another. I still think I'm discovering a lot of that, looking back in a way that I haven't before.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that connecting of the dots is something I really relate to as well. Like taking the assessments, I was like, oh, doesn't everybody do this? Of course
Yeah.
I do this, but it's not ever something I had even considered about myself or that other people might be different.
Mhm.
That was fascinating to pay attention to, especially in my late 40s. How did you come to your diagnosis? And as you experience that, or maybe even as you look back, do you see God involved in that process for you at all?
Yeah, so it kind of started as we kind of talked about, it started in my professional life, really, of I was the director of a small church preschool from 2019 to 2022. And you might notice that those years overlap with COVID. And so one of the things that happened was through COVID, we ended up having kids entering our preschool, at the ages of 3 or 4, and we would be the first place where they were outside the care of their immediate family. And that was an instance where we were beginning to see, these kind of traits of neurodivergence, whether it be autism or ADHD or different things that the family hadn't been aware of, because for them it was just their one child and this is who their child is. And we were able to see kind of what is typical and what's not. And so that was when I started to kind of learn about more about neurodivergence, really started researching ADHD, autism, again, kind of in that educational space, and was doing that for a few years. And people would ask me from time to time if I was neurodivergent when I was doing that work. And I would say no. I would say, I think that I have some of the attributes of neurodivergence, but I don't think that I am autistic or ADHD. And then it was last summer I was spending some time with my brother-in-law actually, and he kind of asked me a little bit more deliberately of like, have you considered that you are neurodivergent? And again, I was like, I don't think so, kind of thinking about it. And for whatever reason, when he asked me that, I thought he was asking me if I had ADHD. That was what was in my mind, and that was kind of the framework that I was working through.
Yeah.
And then it was about a month later that I remember I was standing in my kitchen, I was talking to my wife, and it just like clicked. I was like, oh, he was asking me if I'm autistic, not if I have ADHD. And I
Wow.
texted him and I was like, were you at? And he was like, yeah, like that I thought we like, yes, of course. And so through all of this, I had started to see a counselor. And so eventually I kind of brought it up to her of like, hey, I'm kind of interested in talking about this a little bit more. And she was like, oh, good. I'm glad you brought this up because I was going to bring it up. And this helps it to not be such a shock to you.
Mm.
Um, and so in that moment, she was like, I can send you these assessments. And I was like, okay, let's do that. And I filled out the assessments. And it was just like, completely clear immediately from the results of those assessments, that I am autistic. One of your questions was, how do I see God in that journey? And it was, I often talk about finding God in the space in relationships, that I see God as kind of the tying together what weaves me together with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's where I see God in this process, was it was in relationship with my coworkers and the students at the school, with my family, and all these different places where it started to kind of be like this kind of, I mean, journey is really feels like the accurate word, because it was these kind of steps along the way. Nothing ever felt abrupt or anything like that, but it felt like a path that I was on. And yeah, I definitely think God was a part of that process.
Mm, that's beautiful. Just getting to know you a little bit and having the possibility of having this conversation with another autistic person who's also an ordained minister. Uh,
Mhm.
I'd love to reflect with you today about how autistic people reflect the glory and character of God, not despite autism, but actually in our autistic traits. So that's kind of where I'd like us to focus our conversation today. And we'll try. I tend to have some challenges around back and forth communication, but we're going to try to do a back and forth kind of conversation around this. I'm curious, what's one common autistic trait that you see as a reflection of God's glory and character?
The thing that comes to mind is the sense of justice, right? This idea that there is right and wrong, but it feels even kind of deeper than that, of this sense of what is good, and if we know what is good, we must pursue it. This kind of insistence with that. Um, that to me, in a nuanced way, feels like a reflection of God, because I do think that that same thing can be an obstacle at times, but I do think that it is a pull in the direction to the character of God, even if there are ways in which it can be distorted. If
Mhm.
that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. And I heard some of that come through in your sharing about the tax scenario. There's a
Yeah.
sense of justice there and what's right and what's good and how we must move towards that. And what does that even look like for us? And of course, it makes me think about God as revealed in the Bible and specifically more in the Old Testament, but not exclusively. God is, among other things, a God of justice, right?
Mm,
Um, and works on behalf of justice for,
mm.
especially for those who are marginalized or oppressed. So you talked about the conversation being nuanced. Let's get into a little bit of the nuance for you. Like what do you think about when it goes the other direction and can actually be a barrier, or what's that line, or let's explore that.
Yeah, I think that one thing that I've noticed in myself is this kind of a pull towards an extreme, almost, of that sense of justice, that sense of what is right and wrong, um, can get me to a place where I think to myself, this is what's right. The information of why this is right is clearly out in front of us. People who are not doing what is right must be doing something wrong on purpose. They are deliberately not making the correct choice,
Mm,
um, which can put me into a place of judgment, or even kind of coercion, kind of in that. And I think that that can drive a sense of, I often call it kind of a sense of fundamentalism, whether it be kind of wherever it be on a spectrum that you want to call it, but just this almost extremity of this sense of justice. And I think that that at times needs to be balanced out, with compassion and with an understanding as well of, going, let's go back to the tax thing again, right? Of like, we are a part of systems that we cannot always control all of the choices that we make. We cannot always control the ways in which we participate in these complicated systems, and there needs to be space for that. And I have found that this strong sense of justice can be a challenge in that at times.
that makes a lot of sense. And so part of what I'm hearing you say is that where oftentimes autistic people who have this strong sense of justice, they see very clearly what is right and what is wrong. And it seems so obvious and so compelling. And like everyone in the world should see that and must see that. and must think the same way, but then it could cross over into actively being judgmental or judging
Yeah.
others. And Jesus' words come to me there where Jesus says, "Don't judge, or you will also be judged." And so
Yeah.
I wonder what it's like to live in this healthy tension of I see things and I have this strong sense of justice, and yet I recognize it's not my role to act as judge. That seems like a tension to live in.
hmm Yeah, yeah, it definitely is. And I think it's a good tension to live in. I think it's kind of the right tension of being able to work towards justice, work towards these things, but to also recognize that the judgment aspect of it is it's unfair, and it's not needed. It's not a helpful tool in community building. And I think for me that has been helpful, a helpful recognition that part of my perception on this is my autism, that is having an impact here, and to be able to understand that has helped me to see not everybody's perceiving this topic the same way that I am, and that's okay. And it's okay to be in different places on this. And it has also helped me to kind of distill down to thinking about the decisions we make that do or do not do harm to others. And when there's harm being done, that's the place where I'm going to say a little bit stronger, like, no, this is what's right, this is what's wrong. And then there's times when it's just when there's no harm being done, but it maybe is just not ideal, or it is something like that. That's like, okay, we can kind of take a step back from that, and explore that a little bit more, perhaps without as strong of a stance on it.
Yeah. I find that autistic people can be incredible advocates, which is connected to this issue of justice and also a way I see us reflecting the image of God. God is referred to in Scripture as an advocate and as our advocate. So, like, as I'm hearing you say, if it's causing harm, maybe it's not even causing harm to me or anybody that I know personally, but I still am not okay with that. And I want to advocate however I can to use my voice, my platform, my influence, no matter how small that is,
Yeah.
advocate on behalf of the ones that are being harmed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of another characteristic that I see in a lot of autistic people, and this is this idea or need for structure and order.
hmm hmm
Um, and while I recognize that's not all of who God is, I definitely see that God is a God of structure and order and has built structure and order into the world. So that's one area where maybe again there's some nuance, right? Because it can be taken to an extreme, and I tend to be one who wants to take certain parts of that to an extreme. But I also see how it reflects the glory of God. What do you think about that, or what questions come to your mind?
Yeah, I think that the question that came to mind was kind of the same one that you asked me of. I also kind of find comfort in the structure and ordered nature of God. And when I am invited into the mystery of God, I kind of be like, well, yeah, that's there, but I'm going to stick over here with the kind of structured, ordered part. Thank you. So I wanted to ask you kind of what your experience was. How does it feel to encounter the mystery, or the bigger than the system, the bigger than the order part of God? How do you encounter God in that way?
That's a great question. And actually, I think this is where my dual neurotype really comes into play because I'm
Mm,
also ADHD as well as
hmm
being autistic. And the ADHD part of me really does love
hmm
spontaneity and novelty and surprises. Um, which goes in direct opposition to autism inside me that needs structure and order and predictability. Um, and I think at different seasons of my life, I've swung one way or another.
Mm,
I think I used to feel a lot of shame actually around my need for structure and order. I think that inside my own head, it was me being too much or being high maintenance, which I didn't want to
mm,
be.
yeah.
I think I got some of that feedback from other people as well. And actually, being in relationship with a good number of people who are ADHD, um, that can feel like a threat to my
Mhm.
ADHD friends and family members. And so I think I internalized a lot of shame around that need for structure and order. Um, but just in the last year or so, with my diagnosis, I've actually felt more freedom to lean into that a bit more,
Mm,
not in an aggressive way, but to recognize actually my body is in distress when this happens that's out of order.
yeah.
And it's just not something I can turn off. Like,
Yeah.
I don't, for my whole life, I've, for example, pick up a brand new book and I just literally flip through the pages. I'm not reading, and my eye is drawn to the misspellings on
Mm,
the page. Like I catch them super fast when I'm not even trying to look for them, and then I have to do something to correct that.
mm,
I can even remember on my autism assessment there were some uh, misspelling issues and a couple of grammar issues, and I had to write in the margins like
yeah.
so that they would know like they're sending this out, it's not okay, it needs to be corrected, right? But also recognizing it causes my body a lot of distress, and sometimes my mind as well can't move on until
Mm,
I address the thing that's out of order. Now,
yeah.
I don't have that in every area of my life, but in certain areas of my life, and structure is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting to think about. I can remember I had a professor in seminary who would ask this question of what percent of God can we know? And
Mm,
I remember the first time that I heard that question. At this point in my life, I grew up in church. I grew up going to church, all the time. I grew up in Christian school. I went to a Christian college where I majored in religion. And
mm,
I took so many hours in the religion department. It's too many hours in the religion department. At this point, I was in seminary. I was working at a church. And so I'm thinking, what percent of God can we know? I was like, I know there's a part of God that's mysterious, and I have to leave space for that. But I mean, I've been doing a lot here, and I've got a kind of a lifetime ahead of me to keep doing this work. I'm thinking 70, 75%. That's how much of God we can know.
mm,
And before I could open my mouth and say that out loud in front of a room full of people, a friend of mine said 3%.
mm.
I remember just sitting there and being like, 3%? Three? And it shook me to this idea that like I could spend my life studying God, and maybe there's still 97% of who God is that I'll never understand. And that has continued for me to be like it sometimes it feels like an invitation, and sometimes it feels like a ghost story of like that maybe that's the case. Maybe that's what our human brains are capable of is 3%. Um and that is something that is always kind of, as you said, in that balance with the structure and order and how much I'm kind of called to that structure and order, that might be just a sliver, and that there might be so much more than that outside of that aspect of God as well.
Wow, yeah. And for whatever reason, that makes me think about how I interact with the different persons of the Trinity. My interpretation of the Holy Spirit is the Holy Spirit is a lot more mysterious and free flowing. It's like that
Yeah.
John 3, I think it is, the wind blows wherever it wishes,
Mhm.
and so are those that are born by the Spirit. And it's kind of hard to tell where they're coming from and where they're going, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that can cause me some anxiety. um, especially if my autism is forward. And I actually notice just personally, I notice that when my system is regulated, when I'm
Mm,
not overstimulated, when I'm in a quiet, comfortable environment, I have a lot more capacity for mystery, for unknowing,
yeah,
for uncertainty. Um, but in other instances, it's a real signal for me that I'm not safe. So
yeah,
I feel that way sometimes with the Holy Spirit. For whatever reason, I feel like the Father God is on the other end of the spectrum
mhm,
and is
sure,
the maintainer of order and structure. And then Jesus
sure,
seems like he's kind of somewhere in the middle to me. I don't know.
yeah. No, I definitely get that. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there are times when I think of, like, as you said, kind of like Jesus. Every once in a while, Jesus feels like mischievous to me
Yeah.
almost.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that that is the kind of the same thing if you're saying of if like in my formulation, if God the Father is like the structure and the order, Jesus kind of stepping away from that a little bit into that little bit more free flowing as the wind blows, it feels like divinely mischievous. And that has always been something that's on the verge for me of like, is this okay? Is this really what I think? But I kind of keep returning to it in different ways.
Yeah. I've just recently been writing and creating some for my community on Patreon around defiant Jesus and
Mm,
unexpected Jesus. When Jesus shows up in really unexpected ways and defies the society norms or the religious structures or whatever, and I see that mischievousness. Yeah. So kind of diverged a bit, but that's where my brain goes free flowing. Anything else on that structure or order piece that you want to say?
I think this is maybe a little bit on that, and then maybe it kind of brings us a little bit into the next our next place as well. But I can remember years ago reading about Oscar Romero. Are you familiar with Oscar Romero at all?
A
He
little bit.
was, yeah, Archbishop of San Salvador, 1977 to 1980. He was assassinated in 1980 for speaking out against the far right government of El Salvador at the time. He was assassinated while serving mass, actually, in the church.
Wow.
Um, but through scholars, through reading Romero's journals and kind of studying his life, they think that he might have had OCD, and that that might have been a part of OCD can be hyperreligiosity. That can be kind of one of the aspects of OCD, and I think that that's something we can see in other divergent neurotypes as well. Is this kind of hyperreligiosity, and that's something that I've thought about a lot of the ways in which my autism maybe didn't always bring me closer to God, but a good made me good at church, right? And the ways in which that did bring me closer to God, and the ways in which I think that that did prohibit my relationship with God. But I've thought a lot about how structure and order and this idea of religiosity and the strong sense of justice that we talked about, how those engage with religion and engage with faith in the ways that that can impact our perception of God, and how it can impact other people's perception of us in the ways that we engage with our faith. I think is really interesting.
Yeah, so what's coming up for me as you talk about that is recognizing I've got this part of me that really is quite content and quite able to show up and do the right thing, whether I feel like it or not.
Hmm.
And for me, that's just, it can be as simple as every morning I have an everything bagel with cream cheese, and I have it literally every morning. And I don't even think about what I want to eat for breakfast.
Mm,
That is just what I'm going to eat for breakfast. Um, and that can translate into religiousness and into spiritual practices. And that can actually sometimes be a really good thing. I eat 3 meals a day, not because I'm hungry, but because I believe that you're supposed to eat 3 meals a day, and I will just eat them uh, because I'm
yeah.
supposed to. And so I can do the same thing with spiritual practices. And sometimes that serves me well, and sometimes that doesn't serve me well because it doesn't allow me to connect to what I'm actually experiencing and feeling in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, there's Henry Nouwen, who's a writer. He talks about he visited a monastery one time and talked about sitting in the cell, right? The room of a monk. And he talked about the feeling of being in a place that has been prayed in a lot and how it can feel easier to pray somewhere where people have prayed a lot before because it feels kind of, I think the word he uses is worn with prayer. There's kind of these grooves that have been worked into that place with prayer that makes it easier to engage. And I think, as you said, this idea of like having that habit, even if it's not always desired or felt, it can just make it so that when there is that desire, when there is that feeling, the grooves are set there through the habit that make it a little bit easier to approach. And I think about that a lot. I think a lot about the idea of a place being worn with prayer, and how our habits, our repetitions, can not only help our relationship with God, but we can almost like sanctify a place for other people as well. That my participation in faith practices in a place might make it easier for someone else later to feel the spirit in that place, because it is worn with prayer, and that for me can feel empowering, in a lot of ways.
That's really beautiful just to consider that. One other thing I'll mention here before we move on is I just recently did an interview last episode actually with Erin Burnett, who is an autistic author. She wrote a book called Autism in the Church, and um, she noted that a lot of times autistics, we can be really extreme one way or another, right? And so she noted that sometimes religiously it can swing to legalism, and that was her
Mm,
experience actually.
hmm
And then she's also noted that it can swing the other way to complete atheism for
mm,
autistics. And it's rare to find autistic people who are in anywhere in between, because of that
yeah.
black and white, rigid thinking, all or nothing kind of mentality. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. The the metaphor that I often use is, do you remember, did you ever slackline? Do you remember when slacklining was a big thing a couple years ago?
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. So slacklining was this, like, it was a line that you tied between two trees or whatever, and was kind of had some slack to it, and you could kind of, I don't know, walk on it or jump or do different tricks. I was terrible at it, never able to do it. I could maybe get on while holding one of the trees. Um, but the thing that I always kind of think about is the safest, easiest thing to do on a slack line was to do what I did, which was to stand on the edge and hold a tree, right? It was very unlikely that I was going to fall doing that. But that's not what the slack line is for. It's for
Right.
dancing in the middle, jumping, doing all these different things. And I think about my faith in that regard a lot, of like, for me especially, the easiest thing to do is stand on an extreme, stand on one, legalism, on atheism, whatever that might look like. It's to hold on to that tree and stand still. Um, it is so much harder. It takes so much more work to kind of stand in the middle and balance and find that and discover, but that's what faith is for. That's what it's for, is to find that middle and to try it and fall and get back up and try something new and all of that, um, and to know that I'm gonna fall more in the middle than I would on the edge, but that's okay.
Yeah. I resonate with that a lot. Is there another autistic trait that you think about when you think about reflecting the glory or character of God?
Yeah, I've been thinking about, this is something that you and I talked about a little bit previously. Was, you and I both, are pretty high masking, in our autism, and so I've been thinking about recently kind of my own practice of attempting to, or at different times, kind of demasking and feeling what that feels like. I was thinking about this question, and there's some aspect of that to me that felt connected to the character of God, and this kind of vulnerability that God chose to show to us
Mm,
in creation, in the incarnation, in relationship, that God chooses
mm.
to be vulnerable in relationship with us. And that is a gift that God gives to us, that God does not owe us, but it's an act of grace. And so I've been kind of thinking about that, about what does it mean to show up vulnerably to people and to make that choice, and to lower defenses, and what are the ways that God does that in relationship with us.
That's powerful. And actually, just yesterday, I wrote a devotion called Vulnerable God based on
Mm,
a song that I had written a couple years ago. And it offers this idea that when we open ourselves to be known fully, like as we are, not pretending, not showing up the way we think the other person wants us or needs us to show up, but when we open ourselves to be known and loved, we're also opening ourselves to
mm,
pain and to
mm,
rejection. Like there's no way to do it otherwise. And actually, Jesus, naked as a baby in the straw, completely dependent on his mother, right? Um, Open to love and also
mm.
open to pain and
Yeah.
rejection. And yeah, that's a challenge for me because I think part of the reason my masking developed was because it didn't go well when I didn't mask early on
Yeah.
in my life, right? And there was a lot of pain. And so, as a protector um, from that pain, my mask developed and it is quite strong. And yeah, to open up and to be more vulnerable, which even this podcast for me is a practice in that. Yeah, I feel like God went first by
Mm.
being vulnerable with us first. And that's compelling.
Yeah, I think of you saying that God went first, reminds me of the passage of we love because God first loved us, right?
Yeah.
And that idea that, yeah, that God kind of offered up this vulnerability, and then we get to choose how to respond to that. When thinking about that kind of in a relational aspect of what it feels like when you meet someone new and you start spending time with them, and then that moment when they first kind of offer that vulnerability, whenever that is, and they're taking a risk, because
Yes.
other people can choose to return that, or they can choose to kind of spurn it and to even to weaponize it, right?
Yes.
um and for God to offer that to us is such a gift, and is such a calling to us of how we can respond to that, and how we can then take that as our model, and offer it to others as well. I think that is, what it means to love God and to love others.
Yeah. That feels like an invitation to me to lean more into that as a reflection of the character of God. I appreciate that today.
Mm,
One of the other traits that comes to my mind, and this isn't fully fleshed out, but I'll just throw it out there, is this idea of hyperfixation, right? So, as autistic people, we can get hyperfixated on something that we really are interested in or enjoy. And there's just like this laser beam focus, which I absolutely love. It feels really good in
mm,
my body. I lose track of
mm,
time. They've actually done some scientific studies, and it's possible that for some autistic people, when they're in that state of hyper focus, that they're actually in a restorative state. Like it feels really
mm,
good and restoring to their body, even though they're putting out energy. So when I hyper focus, I do that to the exclusion of other things around me, right?
sure.
And that's not always wise. I can't always control it. And it's not always good for the people around me when I do that. But there's something about the quality of the attention
Hmm.
that to me points to who God is and the quality of attention that God gives. I would probably say everyone and everything. And that is really beautiful to me to consider. obviously God's not doing that at the exclusion of other things. But yeah, what do you think about that? What does that stir in you?
Yeah, I think it is fun to think about of like thinking about God's love as like being God's fixation, like being God's hyperfixation of like God would love nothing more than to know absolutely everything about me, right? That's just kind of like a, that is a that feels good.
Yeah.
That's a love that feels good. Um, and then as like an aspect of how we reflect the character of God, how we can reflect the character of God, I have found that for many people, hyperfixation, it's not a selfish practice
Mm-mm.
because so often when you hyperfixate on something, when I hyperfixate on something, I want to tell so many people about it. I want to
Yes.
tell people about it. I want to talk about it. I want to share it, right? It is often me inviting people into this topic as well. And so again, that feels like this way of, I think so often in our world, the idea of acquiring knowledge, acquiring resources, the next step is then to like leverage those or to hoard those or to monetize those. But I think that this impulse of autism is no, let's share this like with absolutely everybody.
Yes.
And I love that idea of God um, creating, and the idea of creation is that it is to be shared. It's not something to be leveraged or monetized or anything like that, but the aspect of this energy being spent is in order for it to be shared with others.
Yeah, I absolutely love to talk to other autistic people about their special interests. Even
Hmm.
if I'm not interested in their special interest at all, there's a generosity and just a really contagious kind of delight and energy that I can get when I talk to a 6 year old about sea creatures, right? And I
Hmm.
discover sea creatures I didn't even know existed because he studied this and he's so excited to tell me about it. And I think too, there's bound up in that, two things come to mind. Bound up in that is a lot of joy, which I heard as you were saying, like, God wants to know everything about me and is delighted to know
Yeah.
about me. There's some joy bound up in that. And then I think also there's bound up in that there's this sense of worthiness.
Mm.
Like sea creatures are worthy of that kind of interest and delight and knowing. So are rabbits and so are like just, trains, whatever the special interest is, it
Yeah.
actually is worthy of that kind of attention.
Yeah, that's good. I think about I do a lot of I read fantasy a lot and think about there are some fantasy worlds that are created that can kind of stand up to that scrutiny of a hyperfixation, right? And can kind of hold, yeah, keep on exploring, keep on digging. There's more here that you can find.
Mhm.
And there are some fantasy worlds that just can't, that just don't have that amount of depth to them.
Yeah.
And so it's fun to think about again that kind of in our world, that not just God's attention on me, but the way that I can relate to others as this each person that I meet, they have incredible depth to them, and that I, in the same way that might only know 3% of who God is, that I can spend a lifetime knowing somebody and continue to learn about them. I think that for me is something that I struggle with at times, is that I tend to learn something about somebody and be like, okay, well, this is true about you, so now I don't have to worry about that anymore because I understand that now. And it's like, no, you should. It probably is worthy of revisiting from time to time and continuing to ask questions and learn, because people can stand up to that focus and that those questions and that curiosity, and that can be a way to be in relationship.
Yes. People are a special interest of mine, so that actually tracks and it's really easy for me to, and I delight in paying that kind of attention to whatever person is in front of me. Like it
Mm,
brings me a lot of delight. And every time I do it, I sense that I'm only getting a piece of God's delight, but
mm,
I feel like I'm sharing in God's delight somehow as I do that.
yeah.
So I'm watching our time, and I want to get a couple final thoughts from you. Maybe taking this and making it more personal in a second. But before I do that, for those of you who are listening, I just want to say we've only touched on a few. what would you add? Find me on social media or through the show notes and give me your ideas. What traits are we missing? Have we not covered? How do you see God's character revealed in autistic traits? I would be fascinated to hear more. So for you, Harrison, what's one way that you see God's character revealed in your neurodivergence?
I think it is in this kind of what we've been talking about here today, of this idea of love being this mix of vulnerability and interest. And I think for me, those are things that have some complication to them, have some challenge to them, but also feel worthy of spending more time in, and to feel that as how God feels towards me and how I am called to feel towards others. That is a good feeling, even as I know that I'm not done with it yet.
Yeah. So there's some goodness in what is and also some invitation into more, it sounds like.
Yeah, yeah,
And then I know you have a heart for church leaders, and hopefully there are church leaders who are listening to this podcast. I want this podcast to be a space for neurodivergent folk to process our relationships with God and with the church, but also for those who are in relationship with neurodivergent folk, and specifically for church leaders and spiritual leaders. And I'm curious, what encouragement would you give to a church leader who might be listening? Maybe they're not neurodivergent themselves, but they're listening to this podcast.
I think it's just to continue to make space for people and to see diversity in all of its forms as a strength to community, that it is something that requires our attention, to be able to make a space that is safe for a diversity of people, but that diversity is then going to have a positive impact on that community in of itself. That diversity is a strength, and that sometimes that just means, yeah, making space for people, giving options to people, trusting people with their autonomy and their faith, that they have the ability to make choices that are good for them and their faith, and to make space for that.
Hmm. Thank you. That's a good word. I have really enjoyed this conversation. I didn't know what to expect, but the time just flew by for me, and I feel
Yeah.
like we could talk for a lot longer. So thank you. Thanks for showing up today, bringing yourself.
This was fantastic. Thank you so much for the invitation. And yeah, I think we could easily have made this a supersized episode, but I think that I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, at least we're getting the conversation started.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Well, I'll talk to you later.
All right. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Neurodivergent Faith. If you like what you heard, consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing this with someone who might need to hear it too. And as you continue to wrestle with faith and identity, remember, your unique brain is a part of God's creative genius. Whether it's the way you process scripture, engage with prayer, or connect with others, you are a reflection of the vast creativity of our Creator. May you trust that God knows you, delights in you, and is working in you exactly as you are. And may you know that you are not walking this journey alone. See you next time.